this month it was the 150th birthday of Lenin, it would have been, which I thought make an interesting reason to have a meeting on Lenin. We asked a few slightly provocative questions in our invitations, including, are dead Russians like Lenin still relevant today? What, if anything, can we learn from the man who led the Russian Revolution? And didn't Lenin inevitably lead to Stalin and the dictatorship in the Soviet Union? That's obviously, anybody who's been around the left for more than 5 minutes has come across these criticisms and questions. And we had quite a few of them in response to putting on this meeting. For example, we received an email that asked us to distance ourselves from the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat. And I presume the person asking the question associated this with the terror and the horrific crimes committed in the Soviet Union after 1921, 22, 23. We can argue about the particular date when the degeneration really started, and I'm sure we will.
I'm not crossing that paragraph out.
But for Marx, I'm just going to say, what I replied to the person is, for Marx, that concept actually meant nothing more, nothing less than the rule of the working class, the majority of the population, and nothing violent implied, nothing bloodthirsty. Similarly, I think we have quite a lot of work to do to reclaim Lenin and Marx, for that matter, for our movement. But that's exactly what we'll have to do. We have to learn from history. We have to learn from what has worked well, but also have to learn from the mistakes that were being made by our movement and the people leading our movements. I think that's very pertinent at the moment, and I don't want to overstretch the comparison, but in the wake of the defeat of Jeremy Corbyn and the left in the Labour Party, I think some on the left are very keen to simply move on and basically, blame the right in the organization, blame the right in and outside the labor movement, the media, etc. But that would mean actually that we have learned nothing. Next time any lefty gets anywhere near the position that Corbyn was in, he or she might make the same mistakes again, trying to appease the right rather than take them on and politically defeat them, or at least attempt to defeat them. So I think it's important. That's a bit of a stretch, but basically my point is we have to learn from history, and this educational event is very much part of it. I'm very proud to introduce our two speakers. Lars T is an independent scholar who's written widely on the Soviet history and in particular Lenin, especially his work, Lenin Rediscovered, What is to be Done in Context, which I translated into German over many, many long months, is a fantastic work. Professor Robert Arnott is a fellow of the Green Templeton College in Oxford, and has also written a lot about the Soviet Union, and he was a member of the CPGB and is now Secretary of Cheltenham Constituency Labour Party.
I should start by saying I've been around the left, you can see that from the look of me, for something like 55 years. And in fact, my thoughts about Lenin go back that far because my family background was such that I was brought up on Lenin. And so to some extent, maybe you might consider so much of what I could say would be more of a hagiography than a critique. We shall see, but I welcome the comments of the comrades present this evening. I should also say I'm a member of the Labour Left Alliance and an active member of the Cheltenham Group. Well, I'll start off by saying May Day greetings to everybody who's listening. As Lenin said in 1904, comrade workers, May Day is coming, the day when the workers of all lands celebrate their awakening to a class-conscious life, their solidarity in the struggle against all coercion and oppression of man by man, the struggle to free the toiling millions from hunger, poverty, and humiliation. Two worlds stand facing each other in this great struggle, the world of capital and the world of labor, the world of exploitation and slavery, and the world of brotherhood and freedom. These are words that Lenin said in 1904, but I don't suppose that anyone present this evening is going to doubt that perhaps they're as relevant in this May Day today in 2020 than they were 116 years ago. Last month was it was 150 years since the birth of Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, or Lenin, founder of the Soviet Union, and I believe to be arguably the greatest single figure of the most significant event in recent human history, the Russian or October Revolution. Now, as a Marxist, I don't celebrate history as a succession of great men and great events, but I look at it as the history of class struggles that emerge from the contradictions that exist of the development between forces and the relations of production. So, looking at and examining this, in what sense might I celebrate Lenin's greatness within this context? As a Marxist, I see that the greatness of humans and indeed of classes lies in the extent to which they are able to analyze and understand the forces at work in their historical moment, their potentials and limits, and then to use this in a self-conscious practical action that enables the further development of progressive forces that work independently with their will and on their own. Now, as seen from his writings, Lenin's greatness also lay in his clear ability to reflect within the context of Marxist theory the movements that were at work within Europe and Russia as a whole at the time, and to translate this with the Bolshevik Party into revolutionary action that made sense at the time for the masses, for people at critical moments, and that enabled them to make a great leap forward that shaped subsequent history and which continues to shape the 21st century. Now, Lenin's masterly adaptation of Marxist theory to suit the particular circumstances of 1917 does not mean that what he had to say then is not relevant to the present political circumstances in Britain today, and in fact the world today. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic and other factors, capitalism is facing a major crisis. And whilst I am not saying that we are facing a revolutionary situation, I am saying that Lenin's insight is something to which we can still refer, understand, and help shape our own political strategy and tactics. In 1917, at the time of the October Revolution, Lenin's political consciousness was seen within the context of an understanding of a world in which the great monopolies, the capitalist monopolies, were fusing with state power to drive the formation of an unevenly developed capital world market, generating great world crises, imperialist wars, such as the First World War. At the same time, it was throwing together great concentrations of working people into formations of social labor who formed in turn labor movements and socialist parties in the aspiration to build a better and a greater world. It's easy to forget sometimes that how many people in Lenin's day, in fact in Russia alone, called themselves to some degree or other Marxists. Lenin and his immediate comrades were among relatively few in opposite and saw that the development of the capitalist mode of production had reached a point where revolutionary outbreaks were an imminent possibility across the capitalist world. For Lenin and his Bolshevik party, crucial questions of revolutionary strategy and tactics had to be addressed by Marxists as an immediate need, rather than having deferred to some remote period in the future of human history or revolutionary dialogue in cafes, and they succeeded. The greatness of Lenin, therefore, lies fundamentally in that his theory could be usefully adapted and expressed in the form of strategy and tactics of the Bolsheviks and their allies in 1917, providing them with leadership at key moments and enabling them to forge a great revolutionary movement in society. Lenin's leadership and theory enabled him to grasp the weakness of Russian capitalism within the uneven development of world capitalism, and recognize the possibility that it could even determine events elsewhere, which it did. Yet at the same time, Lenin's writings were also punctuated constantly with the recognition that the seminal forms of socialist mode of production were being forged by capitalism itself. In its construction of large enterprises based on the organization of thousands of workers across time and space, in the state's growing role in reproducing the capitalist order, and in the creation of new forms of social infrastructure and communications, Lenin actually saw in his own mind's eye a future emerging out of the present. In a memorable phrase, he claimed, "Socialism is gazing at us from all windows of modern capitalism." More importantly, of course, was that Lenin in his State and Revolution restored the Marxist theory of the state in its rightful place in the heart of revolutionary theory and practice. The essence of a revolution, he argued, is the passage of state power from one class to another. As all understanding, as it was, that governments cannot alone introduce socialism without controlling the state apparatus and using it against the class enemy, deploying its forces to expropriate the expropriators, to set free the socialist relations and forces of production growing up within capitalism. Yet neither can socialism be brought about by the capitalist state machine itself. The transformational phase of a revolution had to have a political form, always has to have a political form, and what has been called, and often misunderstood, as the dictatorship of the proletariat. I told you I wasn't going to leave it out. The phase where the working class has put itself in a position to dictate the direction and pace of change, where it starts to unlock and build the elements of a new mode of production.
Excuse me, Robert, is something wrong with your audio? Is it? Do you have a microphone that you can? It's cranky.
How is it? I'm actually speaking into the computer. Is that better?
I think it might be, yes. Okay.
Okay, I'll get up closer then. Okay. Where was I? Okay. I'll go back on the bit on the dear old.
Okay. We've done 10 minutes, so another 10 minutes. Yes, is that okay?
Oh, less than that.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
The traditional phase of a revolution has to have a political form. It is called and often misunderstood as the dictatorship of the proletariat. At the phase where the working class has put itself in a position to dictate the direction and pace of change, where it starts to unlock and build the elements of a new mode of production. This political form must begin the process of breaking apart the capitalist state apparatus, democratizing its components by subjecting them to the will of the people and building a new state. Lenin's theoretical insights were able to translate into practical action and grip the masses through his position within the Bolshevik Party, guiding its strategy as the party attempted to reflect and express the spontaneous movements of the masses of Russian people, particularly workers and peasants. Unfortunately, the European revolutionary outburst, of which the Russian Revolution formed an integral part, was weaker than Lenin had hoped and was rolled back in Germany, Hungary, and Italy. But yet, Russia's revolution survived. The dictatorship of the proletariat did expropriate the capital class, and it built socialist relations of production. Forces of production were unleashed that were capable of extraordinary, unbelievable feats, and not only shown in the films of Eisenstein, and mobilizations that enabled the defeat of Nazi Germany in 1945. Greater equality was created, mass literacy, and tremendous scientific advances were made. Soviet healthcare, the Shumashko system, was that on which the structure of the British National Health Service was based in 1948. After the Second World War, socialist relations production was spread to other countries in Europe and Asia. Even within imperialist states, these developments led to the creation of a state monopoly capitalism in which working class forces, led by socialist forces, sometimes inspired by the October Revolution, were able to fight for concessions for the peoples from a watchful and frightened ruling class. So the historical significance of Lenin and his work are not in doubt. Even today, after what I hope is the temporary retreat of world socialist forces, Lenin's example and to a great extent his theory still remain of the utmost importance to us. We live in a world where monopolies and multinationals still use state power and use state power and war to divide up the world between themselves and develop it to attack the living standards of their peoples. Never more so much than during the present COVID pandemic. Capitalism is a necrotic mode of production that poses a real threat to the people of the world and has found itself to be completely anachronistic. Compare the wholly different responses to COVID-19 by the Chinese and US governments. Capitalism is economically stagnant, prone to financial shocks that drive it into recession and throw millions of people into destitution and starvation. Capitalism cannot control its environmental degradation or properly respond to the horrific dangers of climate change, nor can it respond to the current global pandemic that threatens to collapse social infrastructure and shatter fragile economies. And I read today that it has the potential in this country alone to create unemployment of up to 6 million people. Working classes and social production are still being created by the capitalist system. Both are bigger than ever before. Peasants and agricultural workers still populate many of the states of the third world, ground down by capitalist agriculture and financial capital. For all the flaws and failures of existing socialism in China, Vietnam, and Cuba, no alternative road to socialism has been discovered that can replace the need for some form of democratizing dictatorship of the proletariat, some reckoning with the control and form of state power as a whole. Marxism will remain relevant for as long as capitalism exists. We must study and understand Marxism and apply it to our own terrible times. Whatever happened to the Soviet Union, Lenin's theoretical understanding of class struggle and the state is still the basis of much of the international working class movement's activities in the 20th century and the 21st century, and continues this day, of course. This is his outstanding legacy. On a number of occasions, whilst in Moscow, I visited Lenin in his mausoleum in Red Square. Repeatedly, I've said to him face to face, rather quietly, because the coppers don't let you talking loudly in there, that he was a great revolutionary and he started to build socialism in Russia, but that he died too young. If he had not, perhaps the history of Russia and the Soviet Union would have been different. If Lenin had been in charge in the 20s and 30s, then the fate of people in 10 countries would have been different and better, and would still today enjoy the benefits of socialism, not poverty, kleptocracy, and xenophobia. Some years ago, when in Berlin, after the wall had come down, I visited the statue of Marx and Engels in Alexanderplatz. Someone had painted on it the words, "not guilty." This is a sentiment that could equally apply to Lenin as well. He remains my inspiration. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. I kind of feel the need to turn this a little bit the other way around and make some criticisms of what happened in the Soviet Union, but I think we'll leave that to the
discussion. Yeah.
As it happens, I'm going to start off with picking up what was said at the end of Bob Arnott's talk, which was sort of not guilty. So I'm going to start with the bill of indictment that one hears about Lenin, and then respond to it in some way. So I'll start off by saying, is Lenin relevant today?
Yeah.
Well, if we look at the common portrait of Lenin today, the answer can only be hell no. Let me quickly run down this bill of indictment. Note that the portrait of Lenin is not just the creation of bourgeois falsifiers. No, many of the key features in this, what I call the textbook interpretation of Lenin, are accepted and propagated by writers on the left, sometimes even admiringly. So this here is the following portrait, which I have to stress so that no one gets misled that I strongly disagree with what I'm about to say. Number one, Lenin was the inventor of something called a party of a new type. Although this little phrase is usually given with quotation marks, I've yet to find it in Lenin's writings. Lenin, according to this party of a new type, looked down on the workers. He was worried about them because he was afraid they weren't revolutionary enough and never would be. So he worked out a new type of party that would be protected against the workers, essentially. One composed exclusively of, quote unquote, professional revolutionaries, defined as radical intellectuals who banded together in a conspiratorial caste party that excluded the common run-of-the-mill workers. The title of one Cold War study of Lenin is calls the party the organizational weapon. Perhaps, so this portrait continues, such a party made sense in the Russian underground, but certainly not today. Two, this new type of party was the direct opposite of the mass social democratic parties of Western Europe, who were open to the wishes of the workers and therefore leaned toward reformism, just for that very reason. Lenin, observing a reformist social democracy in Europe, wanted something completely different in Russia. Third in this bill of indictment against Lenin is Lenin's party took power in Russia as a result of a conspiratorial coup and promptly established a terroristic dictatorship. Four, the Russian Civil War was in large part a war against the Russian peasantry, a dress rehearsal for Stalin's forced collectivization in the 1930s. And then five, on him sort of personally, we hear that he cheated on his wife, he kicked his dog, he got a personal kick from violence, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I've spent a long time looking into these claims over the past couple of decades, and I found they all essentially build large-scale but flimsy constructions on very little evidence. For details, see my numerous writings, but I don't want just to say he wasn't this, he wasn't that, so forth, so forth. Nor do I want to simply replace the demonic Lenin of Song and Story that I've just stated here with an angelic Lenin who can do no wrong. So let me present, as a historian, which is what I am, present three key facts about the actual Lenin of history. And after that, we can take a look at his relevance today from my point of view. Okay, fact number one is the way he defined his political identity, the way he himself defined his political identity for most of the time, for most of his political career. Lenin self-identified as a leader of, quote, revolutionary social democracy. He was a leader of revolutionary social democracy in Russia. He was the, like Jules Gued in France or Karl Kautsky and Rosa Luxemburg in Germany, he was the leader of revolutionary social democracy in Russia. This term, revolutionary social democracy, sounds very paradoxical to us, obviously, but it was the name given to the left wing of international social democracy during the era of the Second International in the decades before World War I. In 1917-1918, Lenin rejected the label social democrat in favor of communists. So that's why we have communist parties at that point. Before that, it was social democrat. But because what was his motive? Because he felt that the banner of social democracy had been dragged in the mud by the Western European parties who supported the war efforts of their respective governments. But this name change was not a rejection, but an anguished affirmation of his own previous political identity. In Lenin's mind, he was the one who remained true to the tenets of pre-war revolutionary social democracy, while the leaders of the most other parties in the Second International who was renegades who betrayed the faith. And let me say just as an aside here that one difference between me and Bob Arnott is he describes Lenin's views accurately, very accurately. I sign on to them, but I think he overestimates the originality. I think there are a lot of other people who were thinking these same things, and Lenin himself always liked to stress how much he was representing a consensus of radical Marxists on views on things. In other words, to go back to the idea of a party, Lenin did not invent a party of a new type that was the direct opposite of European social democracy. On the contrary, he wanted to import the best parts of social democracy to Russia. So what is revolutionary social democracy? In my view, the heart of this outlook was the idea of the historical mission of the working class to take over state power and introduce socialism. And in my remarks, I don't talk about that phrase, the dictatorship of the proletariat, but that's what it is. Only the proletariat, acting as a class, could carry out this mission. But the working class could only carry out its mission if it was adequately prepared. That is, if it understood the nature of the task, understood and was organized enough to act as a class. So these are the self-appointed task of the social democratic parties in Western Europe was therefore to give the needed understanding and the needed organization to the proletariat. And if you read Marx and Engels, there always this pair is always there, enlightenment and organization. And to do this, the Social Democrats, especially in Germany, came up on the ground in practice with an immense array of innovative techniques. We can call this the SPD model, after the name of the German Social Democratic Party. The centerpiece of the SPD model was an enormous socialist press with hundreds of newspapers that fostered a distinctive class identity for the workers. Other tools featured in the SPD model were face-to-face agitation, rallies, leaflets, election campaigns, party-affiliated trade unions, all sorts of voluntary cultural organizations, such as choral societies, and even a widespread use of taverns, workers' taverns, as meeting places. The logic of the SPD model can be summed up as a permanent campaign to instill a sense of mission into the everyday life of the workers. This was the kind of party Lenin wanted to import to Russia. Because of Tsarist repression, it had to be an illegal underground party. But as far as possible under these circumstances, it would imitate the German SPD in particular. For example, Lenin made a political newspaper. The name of it was Iskra. He made it into the centerpiece of his plan for a Russian party. So it's not, you know, professional revolutionaries or the committees. It's getting this political newspaper out there so that people would read it and see it. And in fact, Iskra did become a very influential newspaper in Russia in general, even though illegal and underground.
Sorry, Lars, I think you've got something over your microphone as well. Is that possible? Some paper or something? It keeps...
Okay. Can't see it. Should I try it? Is it coming across at all?
No, this is fine now. Go. Sorry.
Okay, it's better?
Yeah.
Okay. Furthermore, Lenin aimed at overthrowing the Tsar. Why? Because he wanted the political freedom that would allow the full application of the German model. And therefore, far from worrying about workers and their alleged reformist tendencies, Lenin's whole plan depended upon his confidence that the workers would respond to the social democratic message, even when the message was conveyed in a hard to get, hard to read, underground newspaper, especially when you read it in a microform, as I have done. Okay, fact 2. What was Bolshevism? And now I'm defining it before the 1917. As this Russian political current took form after the 1905 revolution in Russia, it defined itself as a particular political tactic. I mentioned earlier that Lenin wanted to overthrow the Tsar. So did a lot of people. But what was his, how did he want to go about it? What contribution could Russian social democracy make? Lenin's answer can be summed up as follows. The upcoming democratic revolution in Russia, that is an anti-Tsarist revolution, can be carried through to the end, that was the phrase commonly used, and achieve all it could if and only if the socialist workers were able to get the peasants to support the proletariat as the leader of the revolution. Some observers on the left, especially, now look back and say, well, at this time, the Bolsheviks only wanted a bourgeois democratic revolution, not a socialist revolution in Russia. What an unambitious program. But there was nothing unambitious about Lenin's vision of democratic revolution. He wanted to transform Russia top to bottom. And of course, he wanted to introduce political freedoms, such as the freedom of the press, precisely so that a flourishing social democratic party could put the SPD model into high gear. The Bolsheviks called the socialist proletariat's leadership role hegemony. Of course, hegemony, hegemony has a lot of other meanings today, most of them rather negative. But in the Bolshevik case, it really is a synonym for leadership. According to the hegemony strategy, the peasants would accept proletarian leadership because they were rational enough to see how this leadership would help them attain their own aims. Excuse me for a second, there's a little message here for me. Okay, can ignore that. The whole political strategy of the hegemony rested on the assumption that there exists some vital common interests between the peasants and the workers, both needed and wanted full democratization of Russia. And to jump ahead a bit, this strategy of hegemony, of proletarian class leadership of the peasants, became the basis of Bolshevik victory in 1917 and during the Civil War. The Red Army was hegemony in action, a peasant army fighting to protect the revolution that gave them land and eliminated the gentry class. So it wasn't only the capitalists that were expropriated, even more drastically and radically and ruthlessly, the whole gentry landowner class was expropriated. That took orders, this peasant army took orders from an urban-based workers' political party. And this means, to jump ahead yet another decade, that Lenin's attitude toward the peasantry was the opposite of Stalin's forced mass collectivization in the 1930s. In fact, during the Civil War, Lenin denounced in colorful terms any effort by Bolsheviks to use force as a way of getting the peasants to join collective farms. And finally, fact number 3 about popular support or lack of it in the Russian Revolution of 1917. You know, for the first 2 facts, Lenin and revolutionary social democracy and the Bolshevik attitude toward the peasantry, I feel that I personally have a mission to bring these basic facts to the attention of the public, because I don't think they've been said by anybody appropriately strongly enough in the past. But in the case of the Russian Revolution of 1917, if you read any competent history of 1917, you will learn that by the time of the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks did have strong majority of support in the mass-based Soviets for their program of all power to the Soviets. All other political forces, the so-called moderate socialists, the liberals, the monarchists, had their chance to exercise power and had thoroughly discredited themselves. Of course, many historians don't like the fact that the Bolsheviks had such strong support, especially in the working class and in the soldiers. They explain it away by saying that the Bolsheviks made wild demagogic promises, etc., etc. Nevertheless, even they do not deny the fact itself. Here's the bottom line, I think. The workers and the soldiers in late 1917 made a choice to accept Bolshevik leadership for their own reasons. perhaps owing to what can be called a passionate lack of alternatives. The crisis faced by Russia at that time, there seemed to be no other way out, and people knew about the scope of the problems, but they saw that the other forces in Russian society were not capable of meeting them. Okay, I have outlined, I have lots to say about sort of what happened afterwards and what went wrong, but I did not include it in these remarks, and I can go into that, Tina, with questions and so forth. I have outlined these essential facts about the actual historical Lenin. And whether or not this makes Lenin relevant today, besides that question, I think we all should be aware of these kind of facts and to push back against the constant demonization efforts aimed at someone, against someone who, after all, will always remain a major figure in the history of the left. That is, there's a tendency to sort of give up and concede Lenin to the other side. Yes, he was a bad guy. And if you do that, you let the other guy win. As a historian, my job is to make the past come alive in its own terms. So I'm not the one to give answers about Lenin's relevance today, more than anybody else. However, instead, I'll ask you, these panelists and everybody here, and the people listening in the seminar, I'll ask you some questions. Fact number one, you recall, was Lenin's self-definition as a revolutionary social democrat. So here's my question. Does the idea of a historical mission for the working class or any other group have any resonance today? Is that idea still really one that animates people? Does the project of bringing enlightenment and organization to this group with a mission stand any chance of success? Lenin used an underground newspaper to bring on enlightenment and organization. What do you use? What I'm trying to say is, that last question is that the Social Democrats back then were innovative in their use of up-to-date, cutting-edge communication techniques. So I think that's one thing that we should still be today. Fact number two is the tactic of Bolshevik hegemony, that is, class leadership of the peasants by the workers. Well, there aren't too many peasants in the modern capitalist world, although, as pointed out, there are lots of peasants in the world at large, but in the modern capitalist world, not so many. However, the basic logic of Bolshevik hegemony is the claim that the socialists can provide the most effective leadership for achieving short-term aims, precisely because they see these short-term aims as means to the greater goal of full socialism. So in the case of the workers and the peasants, the short-term goal was democratization of Russia, democratic revolution. And the socialists could do that because they saw how important democratic revolution was to socialism. So, are there today any partial allies who can be brought on board under socialist leadership in a joint effort for a radical extension of democratic institutions? Fact number three was majority support for the Bolsheviks in the revolution of 1917. And here's my question, it's more subdued, and it goes to some of the questions that will probably come up. Is there a way to get majority support for radical change in response to a crisis without arousing the furious resistance that will kill democracy even if it is successfully repressed? That is to say, it's one thing to say that we need to put down the class enemy, but if it so doing requires killing off democracy, you had to, what is that expression? You had to destroy democracy in order to save it. We haven't gotten too far ahead. I've tried here to present today three basic historical facts about Lenin that should replace the essentially phony picture dominant today. Lenin, as revolutionary social democrat, puts him in the context of his own political identity. The centrality of Bolshevik hegemony, which was central to how the Bolsheviks looked at the world and to what they did in 1917. And the tactic of leadership of the peasants by the workers, and majority support for the Bolshevik platform of all power to the Soviets in 1917. So my thanks to all of you for the invitation to speak, for the opportunity to hear Bob Arnott and the rest of this discussion, and thank you.
Thank you very much. Lars, it doesn't happen often that you get a meeting where the main speaker asks question of the audience.
Right.
Took notes.
Right.
It's joking. Okay, I've got the first few speakers lined up. First, I'm taking Anne McShane, who had her hand up first. I'm unmuting you now. You can speak.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, firstly, I'd like to wish all comrades happy May the 1st, and thank you to the panelists and to Tina for convening this meeting. I live here in Ireland, and obviously, like other people throughout the world, I'm feeling a great sense of frustration and despair at the situation we find ourselves in today. And would say never has there been such a need for us to have these kind of discussions, and so therefore I very much welcome it. The point that I really wanted to make, and I suppose it's really, well, for both panelists, but particularly for Lars in relation to his description of Lenin as the Democrat, which I very much agree that that's the Lenin that we need to defend against the attacks. And often I believe that history is like, that the left reads history backwards and looks at the Lenin under siege, or the Soviet, the early Soviet society under siege, and looks at the Lenin who responded to those circumstances as the Lenin that needs to be emulated. My own work in recent years has been on the women's movement in the early Soviet Union and on the Zhenotdel. And as people may know, I would think the panelists will know, Lenin was a very strong supporter of women's emancipation. However, I would say that the point I would make is that the introduction of the new economic policy in 1921 and the banning of factions in the party on the question of the workers' opposition, I think created a major crisis and led to something which I think was never recovered from. And that's really just in relation to what Lars said there about democracy. The denial of democracy, I think at that stage, led to huge problems in terms of the nature of society itself. And I think that it's that democracy and that understanding of the need for democracy in the here and now that we really need to raise, because I think that lots of the time the people look back at Lenin and the experience of the Soviet Union and they think of it as a despotic regime. They think of it as the kind of regime that will crush all dissent. And that, I think, is a major problem for us in the here and now. So Lenin the Democrat, yes, and I think that I would be interested to hear from the panelists on their, on their approach to this question. Which I think for me, while not wanting to hold the Bolsheviks in some sense like guilty as though I'm putting them on trial, was show that I'm trying to say that this period in time, the period after the Civil War, when they retreated, has created a situation for us today which sometimes seems like it's unsurmountable. Thank you, Tina.
Thanks, Anne. I should have said, if you want to speak in the debate, please click the button that says raise hand. It's a little blue hand will show up because I cannot actually see you. So don't do that. I can't see your hand. Next, I'm taking Sugar. Hello, nice to see you again.
Hi, comrade. Thank you for inviting me to have a chance to ask questions. And first of all, May Day solidarity to all the comrades. It is a hope of raise for all of the working class across the globe to fight for socialism. Thank you, comrade. So my question is first about is that the First World War created a situation favorable for the socialist revolution in Soviet Union. That's why it happened. It is rather than the Marx predicted, the class tension which will be created and ultimately will lead to the revolution. So the Marx predicted that tension is building up in England. That is going to be the first nation having the Soviet working class revolution. So do you think that is the right statement because of the First World War contributed rather than the Marx prediction? And the second thing is, I'm going to ask that, is that the NEP introduced by the Lenin in 1921, anything to do with the Chinese policy, what they are doing right at the moment, the caged capitalism, what I would like to call what they are doing? Because after the revolution, you need to have a wealth in order to distribute among all the people, and in order to have an engine power to make further wealth creation. So do you agree with that? NEP is something like similar to the Chinese policy of caged capitalism. Thank you, comrade.
I should say to Robert and Lars, if you want to come in the debate, give me a quick indication. I would say that I take 3-4 more and then perhaps bring you both in for 5 minutes each. Next, I'm taking Marie, who I thought, oh, sorry, no, I've made her into, oh, sorry, hold on a second. I have kicked her out by mistake. Sorry, Marie, I'm making you into a panelist again. Sorry, Marie. There we go. Unmute you. I thought you live in London. It looks like you're in. Well,
yeah, I am in London. Yeah, I've just changed the background
cool.
so that you're properly confused. So can everybody hear me? Yeah. Okay. It's obviously a very important discussion. I'm very proud of LLA to put forward. Hold on, would you like to unmute the microphone?
You are unmuted. You can carry on speaking. We can hear you.
Okay. So this is a beautiful discussion because it's central to the developments in the Labour Party. In the end, in the Labour Party, they have a view that the Soviet Union was a long time ago. It was a failed experiment, and it was led in the end it led to a dictatorship, according to them. And now in the Labour Party, we have to look for another road. And there is a lot of comrades who are not against socialism, who are not against nationalization or workers' control, but they do not want something which myself I'm going to call a worker state, because I don't think that the Soviet Union isolated in the world could be complete socialism. It was on the way, but it was stopped. And therefore I'm going to call it a worker state in order to make things simpler. I think the last speaker was very interesting, the lady who spoke, when she spoke about democracy. What I see in the Labour Party is a complete confusion and mystification of the concept of democracy. So democracy is the right to speak. Yes, but the right to speak to say what? In the end, the right to speak is related to class. So my boss wants me to shut up and he wants me to listen to him, to his dictates. And so the democracy for him is to exploit me. And my democracy is to stop him from exploiting me. And I think the 1st of May is a lovely day in which to raise all these issues and to say ourselves in the LLA to conclude that democracy is when the person who is producing the wealth, the mass which is producing the wealth of the country, has the right to speak. And that if anybody is stopping that right to speak from the working class, it means that they are the dictators. They are those who are trying to perpetuate their privilege, their right to exploit others. So we are here in a big debate, and the question that was raised by Corbyn when he spoke about for the many and not the few. This is calling my attention, because in the end, it's not for the many that we want to be, it's for everyone. And I forgot which of the speakers actually developed that in the Soviet, I think it is Lars, in the Soviet, everybody could be there. And that the right wing made a real hash of it. And because when they were speaking, then they were exposing the revolting notions that they had, and they were losing the arguments. This is how the Bolsheviks were winning, because they had the most scientific view, the most unselfish, the most objective view of the need to develop the whole of society, not just the many, but everybody. So the Soviet Union represents, I think, like Bob said, it represents something which has shaken the world and is still shaking it now. It is now, in my opinion, it's pointing to the way, it's pointing us in the way that there are certain things which have to be done in order to get the mass of the people to actually express themselves. The experience of Corbyn has shown that if you try to advance towards power, you are going to get stopped, that the whole apparatus of state is opposed. And so that the conclusion for Corbyn now is to go back, or the Corbynists, to go back and to say, right, how do we equip the mass of people to actually stand up to the repression and to the intimidation of the state? And I think that, of course, is going to be developed by others much better than me, but I'm very moved by the fact that this has been brought to the surface. And I would say that as a conclusion, you have democracy when those who are producing the wealth are those who are distributing the wealth. And that was, in fact, started with the Soviets, the Soviet Union, in the Soviet Union. And then when the Soviets declined and stopped functioning, remember there was a civil war, so it was not the time to have a Soviet. And so the Soviets retreated, and after that there was a retreat in the political leadership. A lot of the comrades had died in the civil war, and those who actually took control of the party, of the Communist Party, had been friendly to the revolution, but they were administrators and people who had not been in the great majority, they had not been in the taking of power. So I just one more sentence to finish. I think it's important not to throw Lenin down the bath. If there has been a retreat, it hasn't been the fault of Lenin. It has been the strength of capitalism and private property that have been able to weigh again in the party and to make it retreat. Bye-bye.
Thank you. I'm going to take Bob next. And just to remind comrades, if you want to speak, please click that button that says raise hand. So we can see you. I also need to then be able to switch on your camera. There's a lot of discussion in the chat about coup or no coup. Was it a coup? Was it no coup? People might talk about that or not, but please indicate if you want to speak about it, please.
I presume you can hear me, comrades?
Yep.
Yeah, thanks to Bob and Lars, and greetings to everybody listening today, very informative. Coincidentally, I've just been reading Lenin's left-wing communism and infantile disorder in terms of what we can learn from Dead Russians, as the title was called. And it's quite a little gem of a book, which if comrades haven't read it already or should reread it, it's very interesting. Yeah, the relevance for today, I mean, one of the things that I picked up from this gem was the idea that Lenin spoke about the working class needing to have a comprehensive understanding on all political issues that affects our class, that affects the working class movement, obviously not just in Russia, but throughout the world, and particularly in Europe at the time. He was quite critical of the early socialist movements throughout Europe, Germany accepted, but he was quite critical of the Independent Labour Party and the Fabians. He attacked them for their rawness and political naivety, I think he referred to them as. When he talked about all political issues, for me, much has been made quite correctly in this modern era of defending national health service, defending comprehensive free education. Of course, absolutely fundamental in society for all to have equality to services. But when I think you're talking about class power, I think you have to also challenge political institutions within the particular society. And I think this is what came out in this particular book. And then obviously in Britain, we're talking about ideas around what does the monarch represent? You know, what does the British Constitution represent? And these, I think, embody power structures within Britain. And I think you have to start looking at, and you have to start raising Republican demands about the abolition of the monarchy, the House of Lords. You have to start questioning the Privy Council, not just as a sideline to the importance of the bread and butter issues like the National Health Service and education, but as a centrality in your politics, in your mission of intent, if you like, within society. I think that's one of the key things that I've learned from this particular book, or what this particular book reminds me, and from what we're discussing now about dead Russians. That's it.
Thank you, Bob. I'm going to take David next. I'm going to spotlight you and unmute you.
Hello?
You can go.
Can I go? Can you hear me?
Yes. Thanks, Dave.
Okay. So I'm listening to this, and I was, listening to stuff about the Red Army of comrades of mine, and I'm a veteran. I'm an Afghanistan veteran. I'm we're 9% of the UK population. We were conditioned by the state to kill in what essentially was unjust wars, which has resulted in disproportionately high levels of poor mental health, addiction, prison convictions were 1 in 10 in the prison system, homelessness and suicide with the highest. We have the highest suicide rate of any demographic. If we consider that we are exploited public sector workers with a complete lack of credible community support, it's been offshored to charity. The charity sector, veterans charity sector, is worth just over £3 billion, and there's still people on the streets. And we have no union to fight these issues. No union. Should we not, as people, as the community of the left, seek to support them, support my community, and bring us into the workers' union and the workers' movement? Should we not do that? Thank you.
Thanks, David. I'm going to bring in Alan Gibson as the last speaker before I bring in Lars and Robert again, I suggest, and then we can have another round of questions and comments. I'm unmuting you now, Alan. Fire away.
Yeah, just 3 points. Firstly, in response to Bob's claim that the Soviet Union established socialist mode of production, I think that's manifestly not true. It would seem to me that the Soviet Union got stuck in the period of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and that's evidenced by the continued existence of a state. So, because the transition to socialism and communism, one of those elements is the state withering away, and one could almost argue that the opposite occurred in the Soviet Union. So it clearly wasn't socialism in the sense that Marx and Lenin and so on talked about it. Secondly, just in response to Lars's third question about killing off of democracy. That's a complicated one, because in one sense, the pre-revolutionary democracy was killed off. Bourgeois democracy in its particular form under Tsarism was killed off, and it was replaced by proletarian democracy. To the extent you might want to abstract democracy away from having a class basis, which I don't think you should, but to the extent you do that, then this lower form of democracy, the limited form of bourgeois democracy and ultimately fake democracy, was replaced by a higher form of democracy, proletarian democracy, in the form of the Soviets. And I'd also take up the Lars's contention that Lenin did not at any stage create a party of a new type. Now, obviously, words only mean what they mean, but it's pretty clear that if you look at the response of Lenin and the other leading Bolsheviks to the betrayal of August 1914 by the bulk of social democracy, including much of what would have been called its revolutionary wing, that it wasn't just a continuation of the old, there was something changed. The conception of all the wings of social democracy was that, this is prior to World War I, was that it was a party of the whole class. Now, obviously didn't mean that exactly, but what it meant was it was a party of all the political activists struggling for socialism, across the reformist to the revolutionary wing. Bernstein was part of social democracy as a kind of extreme revisionist and reformist wing, just as Lenin and co at the other side of that spectrum were also part of social democracy. But part of the lessons learned by Lenin and the Bolsheviks of that betrayal in August 1914 was the need for organisational and political separation from the reformists. And that, I think, is just manifestly obvious in the formation of the Third International as separate from the Second International. And I think that's a very important lesson which still holds true today, because very often you're running up against what might be called those in favour of unity. And they want unity not just in campaigns around specific issues where there is agreement on the specific demands being raised, but they want unity in a wider sense between the reformist and revolutionary wings. And these are quite often what manifests itself in kind of centrists. So it's a difference between a perspective which would see in the British context the importance of the Labour Party as a party of the whole class, representing all wings from the reformist to the revolutionary wings, as being the vehicle for transforming society, as opposed to a revolutionary Bolshevik perspective, which would see that it would be necessary to create a party of revolutionary Marxists, and that would be the vehicle for bringing about revolution and the overthrow of capitalism. And that's very important. I think that's particularly important for you comrades in the LLA, because what is your role? Is it to make the, do you see the Labour Party as the vehicle for the transformation of society as it exists with both those wings? And I'm not just talking about your particularly Blairite reformists, but also the left reformists like Corbyn and co, who are, in the terms I'm posing them, as much of a barrier and obstacle to socialist revolution as the right wing, and need to be separated from as much as the right wing reformists. Finished. Thanks.
Thanks,
and happy International Workers' Day to everybody.
Funny you should ask that, what we think about the Labour Party is. There is a discussion, no question, and there's different views, but I thought most of us believe that the Labour Party is an area of the struggle rather than the vehicle that will deliver or can possibly deliver socialism. So I think we agree on that one. Okay, I'll bring in Lars first, 5 minutes to respond to some issues, questions if you like.
Right, okay, I'm unmuted. Okay, you can hear me? Okay, first there was some discussion sort of underneath here about coups, and it's so ridiculous to call the Bolshevik thing a coup in October, whether you like it or not. I mean, you can be against it, but why call it a coup? It just makes no sense at all. And not only was it not a coup, but it was legal. It, you know, in February there was a Soviet was set up, and the Soviet. And the one in Petrograd and the one all around the many around the country, everyone accepted. I call it an unwritten constitution. Everyone accepted they had the final say about who the government was, the first government, the second government, the coalition. So and they could do that because the army was on their side. And in the second Congress in October, there was a regularly called Congress of Soviets, there was a regularly election. They put in this new government. It was what had happened all through 1917, except this time it was all socialist and therefore all Bolshevik. So anyway, on democracy, okay. Here I'm going to have to sort of, I've been sort of pro-Lenin, you know, with this, but I want to push back against this sort of way of excusing Lenin that people have, that they're at least not putting the complication of the problems. One is to say that it was only with the later on in the 20s, during NEP, after Trotsky left, banning the faction banning resolution. 1920, late 1920, early 21. It was proletarian democracy, which is a different kind of democracy. The fact that we all have to face is that almost immediately, under pressure of the Civil War, but not only that, almost immediately, there was no independent political life in Russia for anybody but the Bolshevik Party. It wasn't for the oppressed classes, that's for true, and it wasn't for the workers, and it wasn't for the peasants. You couldn't go out and start your own newspaper. You couldn't, you know, the right to speak was highly limited. This is just something that happened right away. It happened under Lenin, and it continued through the Soviet Union right to the end. It was changing in the last, under Perestroika. So, so this is something we just have to deal with, that you can't put it off. There are reasons for it. But as I said in my question, you have to have questions about how you can avoid having those reasons, because once you do it, that's where you are. And then the idea of political freedom was very central to Lenin up to 1917, and then it sort of drops out. And that's why in this discussion we haven't had it, much of it. Political freedom, it seems like from the remarks that were made, I agree with some of what you were saying about democracy. I guess it was David I have here. No, Alan. Right? Yeah, but I don't think you want to go around saying that a higher form of democracy is one that does not have political freedom, such as freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and the like. And I'm going to say one more thing about why. One reason continuity with the past is the idea of a campaign with all these you know. All the tools that the socialists used. What happened under the Soviet Union was they became what I call state monopoly campaignism, which is that only the state could put on a campaign, and they did. They put on campaigns, the newspapers, everything, all the way to the end. So that's another thing everyone associates with Soviet socialism, is this idea, you know, the rallies, the posters, the newspapers, and the fact that no one else except the state and the party had a right to use those means. And finally, I wanted to say that I agree about the party of the new type, that there was a change in Lenin's mind about exactly what you said, getting the opportunists out and everything. The expression party of a new type is not used to mean that. Used to mean what he said and what is to be done back in the day and so forth. So there was a change in the time of the war to get rid of the opportunists, but the Third International was supposed to be like the Second International without the opportunists. In particular, this idea of mass campaigns and other things like that. So that's my notes on those topics. I'm off. I'm finished. Yeah, you can go.
Thank you very much, Lars. Bringing in Robert now for 4 5
Okay. I think I've got to unmute myself.
You are unmuted. We can hear you.
Okay, you can hear me. Okay, fine. I've just got a few comments to make on some of the points that were made. First of all, from Anne, greetings from a fellow Irishman, by the way. It's an interesting one about the issue of democracy, because I've always believed, and my study of the period is, you've got to put it in the context of what was happening at the time. The October Revolution, and soon afterwards, you had the imperialist powers physically trying to strangle the new socialist state, or I'll call it socialist state, for want of anything at the time. Wasn't it something like 14 countries attacking from Archangel up through the Caucasus and out from in from Vladivostok? can you maintain a semblance of democracy at that time when you're fighting a bloody civil war? You know, to retain your identity and to contain what you have achieved. I mean, that's a question I'm going to power out. Perhaps Lars has a view on that. Sugar came at some interesting points about of course, the First World War. Yes, I mean, I've always believed that the incompetence of the Russian military leadership and the massacre of hundreds of thousands of young Russian soldiers during the First World War had much to do with the soldiers joining the Soviets and fighting for what they believe. We mustn't lose sight of the demands on the 7th of November 1917 weren't for a socialist world, although Lenin, of course, came out with those famous words, and that we now proceed to construct socialist structures. But of course, it was peace, land, and bread. Let's not forget that. It was a physical and actual demand that people could relate to. And of course, that also leads one to thinking about this whole question of a coup, which I agree with Lars. I believe had popular support and through the Soviets with that slogan, peace, land, and bread. It wasn't a coup. A coup, we know ourselves in places all around the world in the last 50 years cannot be compared what was happening then. There's a few more comments. One about David, I'll dwell on. Others have talked about the other ones. David, I'll dwell on. Our colleague ex-serviceman. Good to hear you speak, and I agree with everything that you've said. And yes, the answer is yes. You and your fellow ex-servicemen should be part of our struggle, and we mustn't ignore you whatsoever. Alan poses some interesting points. Again, about this whole question of democracy. I'll start off by what he said about the socialist mode of production. I think they were trying. I think they were trying to get there. It's all very well for us to sit here now and criticize what they're doing. They didn't do this within an ideological context. But they had a lot got to go on. They hadn't got a lot of experience. And I think they achieved something. And I think they achieved a great deal. And for whatever criticism you can have for the Soviet Union after Lenin's death and the times of Joseph Stalin and others, it was that creation of a mode of production that managed to defeat Nazi Germany. And if the Soviet Union and the Red Army hadn't defeated Nazi Germany, I'm not entirely sure that we would have the privilege of sitting here this evening having this conversation and discussion and meeting. That's a point for another time. The last point that Alan makes, I think I don't agree with. There's one thing I've always wanted to do from my own political background for the last 55 years is to achieve some semblance of unity on the left so we can work together, develop ideas together. This is why I'm a member of the Labour Left Alliance. I'm in the Labour Party. I haven't been following the little boxes at the front, but I noticed one thing about me, about being a constituent Labour Party secretary, yes. And I make no apologies about it. In fact, if you come and live in Cheltenham Labour Party is the only show in town. And I'm proud to have joined it, only recently because Jeremy Corbyn was the leader of the party, and I agreed to take up office to help organise things, and I make no apologies for that. But I also, from that standpoint, and from that position as a CLP leaders, as my colleagues from Cheltenham will be many, I think, are here today, Ken, Tam, and others, will tell you that we're trying to develop a left policy within that, and I think we're getting a long way to achieve that. I found the discussion interesting. I hope we can, in the next quarter of an hour, we can have some other interesting and useful points.
Thank you. We'll finish at about 8, but we might finish a little bit earlier. So, okay, I'm taking the next round of contributions from the floor, and I'm going to call in first Tamdeen Byrne, please. And I'm unmuting you now. Nice to see you.
Thank you. You can hear me okay?
Yeah, all good.
Yeah. Oh, God, there's my alarm going off. It's supposed to do something with the oven, but it'll hold. May Day greetings to all comrades. Thoroughly enjoying this. I think we have tended to get a bit caught up in what for the moment, and for this is relevancies about coup and so on. We're talking about the legacy of Lenin and trying to answer hopefully some of these questions that Lars has posed what's the significance for us today? So just a couple of ideas on that. I've thought of about that last question, but does the idea of the historic mission of the working class hold today? Well, I would have thought that given the importance that's been shown of workers, of what they've been described as key workers, and who are key workers, is showing the relevance of that above all. I mean, we've heard so much talk in recent years of the working class is dead and so on, and that they don't recognize themselves as workers anymore. This is one of the key lessons of what is going on right now, the historic mission of the working class, that and showing that the ruling class is proving itself incapable of carrying out what needs to be done. That in one way or another they weren't prepared for this coronavirus, and are proven, particularly here, failing at dealing with it. And the education tools that we would use today, this is one of them right here and now that suddenly appeared, using Zoom and us being able to get in touch and debate and discuss much more freely than we were doing before. And we can do this internationally, we have this technology to enable us to do this. So this is a wonderful tool that we have. And just one other point, especially I think that ties in, especially with the Labour Party, it's been get brought up in various forms, people talking about democracy, but then concentrating on democracy in the very early Soviet Union. Whereas I want to touch on is the question of party democracy, that this was key to the Bolsheviks. And this is such a lesson for us today, that there was no banning of factions before the revolution, that party democracy was encouraged in the party press, particularly discussion. And what above all we need to learn, and it's so abundantly clear now, is the total lack of democracy when there was a coup that everyone recognizes by John Landsman in Momentum, and completely emasculated that organization. That's probably a sexist term now, is it? Emasculated. But the need for party democracy is abundantly clear. And that's a great lesson from Lenin. That's all I've got to say. Thank you, comrades.
Thanks very much, Tam. I'm calling Alec Price next. There you go.
Okay. So thanks for all the contributions so far. Particularly, I liked Marie's comments actually as well. In terms of Lenin, so yeah, there's lots of debates we can have about historically what he did and who he was, etc. But for me, the key thing was the method that he used, and how that method was able to inspire masses of working class people to take power. Now, one of the key slogans that the Bolsheviks used, as I think Rob talked about, was about peace, land, and bread. And what's important is the method that he's used to come up with that slogan, because it's talking directly to the working class about what it is that they're aspiring to at that time. It's not the case of it's some sort of perfect slogan that can just be picked up and used today. It meant something specific to the time. So when he's talking about peace, that's particularly relevant because you've got World War I going on, where you've got people being sent to die in their millions on the front. When he's talking about land, he's specifically talking about land for the peasantry in Russia, which at the time were a majority of the population. And in terms of bread, he's talking to, quite a lot of Russian people, but particularly working class people who were starving in the main cities. Now, a lot of those things aren't relevant to today. We haven't got a world war on, haven't met any peasants in the UK recently. And there is actually an increasing issue of food with the rise of food banks, etc. But not on the scale that we were seeing in Russia at that time. But the point is, it's not to replicate those slogans word for word. It's to use the method that you need a very clear idea of what you're fighting for that is relevant to working class people at that time. And actually, when you look at something like the Labor Manifesto we had in 2019, which had quite a number of good policies in a way, it didn't really boil it down into some key relevant issues for people. It was just, there was so much stuff going on there. It was very, very confusing. So I think this idea that you agitate around some key demands which people can get behind is absolutely crucial. The other thing that people, yeah, I agree, Marie. It wasn't a perfect manifesto at all, but I was talking more about the fact that it was so full, and the messaging didn't bring it down to some key points. Someone was talking about left-wing communism, which is like a sort of publication by Lenin. But what that book actually is that was basically a book that Lenin left in hotel rooms around Russia when the Bolsheviks had called an international conference. I think it was the second Communist International was like the sort of technical name of it. But basically it was where in 1919, where you just finished World War I, you had mass parties of genuine socialists. I'm talking about hundreds of thousands of people, and they all sent delegates to Russia to work out what we needed to do to actually bring about socialism across the world. And that was obviously a pressing task of the day. So a lot of those arguments are carried on in that second Communist International. So it's worth following on the debate that happens at that conference, because actually it relates to this idea that should social democracy, should like the Labour Party be like one thing, and should like genuine socialists sort of being a separate thing. And what they discuss at that conference is obviously you organise as genuine socialists together, but when they're talking about places like Britain, and you've got people, by the way, like Sylvia Pankhurst attends that conference. We have a big debate about the Labour Party and what they should do about it. And the Bolsheviks, including Lenin, are actually arguing that yes, you need to set up what they call the Communist Party, a party of genuine socialists, really, but you need to affiliate to the Labour Party. And in fact, they made it a condition of membership for this Communist International that the group in Britain should affiliate to the Labour Party. Now, that wasn't because they had illusions in the reformists in the Labour Party. It was about using it as a way of talking to the mass of working class people, using it as one arena of actually talking to the class. And again, it kind of links in with that same type of method that comes up with slogans such as, bread, peace and land. It's about talking to the workers, it's about being involved with the workers. In terms of what is that book called, someone asked. I can't remember the exact title of it, but there's I think it might be published by Haymarket Books, something like that. And it's a guy who's basically translated all the documents of the Second International and sort of put them all together. I think his name's John something, I can't remember exactly. But if you Google it, I'm sure you'll find it. So really it's about
you wind up a little, Alec?
Yeah, sure. It's about orientating towards the working class in your organisation, including if that means Riddell, it is Riddell, yeah. Including if that means affiliating and organising through, reformist organisations like the Labour Party. If the massive working class of people are there, but also it's making sure your messaging isn't confused. It's about finding out what the working class people want, putting that into a clear slogan, and showing them that you are the most determined group to make that happen, to make it a reality. And if you are working class and you're involved in the working class movement, then you'll know what those slogans are. So I'll wind up there and allow other people to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Alec. I'm taking Derek Fraser next.
Hello. Yeah, is Lenin relevant today? For me, absolutely. Two main things are what I'll just say. First of all, is about his tactical flexibility, but also about his understanding of capitalism and how it's still relevant today. 1916 was his pamphlet, Imperialism, which argued that capitalism creates, rather than creating competition, actually creates monopolies. And in the drive to outproduce each other, capitalists seek new markets for their products and raw materials to produce their products. They cannot exist within national boundaries. Could not be more relevant today. If you look what's happening in parts of Africa, Chinese capital there, and in the past with obviously Britain in Africa as well. So, his writings for me are absolutely central to an understanding of the system. And if you want to get rid of the system, you've got to understand it. And actually, before the First World War, there was many socialists arguing that, capitalism could be reformed, Karl Kautsky and so forth. Actually, Lenin argued that the drive to concentration eventually led to war, and he was proved right. And we've been proved right, time and time again. Many people here, I suppose, have been on Stop the War rallies and various marches. Increasingly, it leads to war. So, his writings to me are particularly relevant. But the thing about me is his tactical flexibility, which I think we must all have inside the Labour Party or outside the Labour Party, for his arguments for, even starting within the Duma, the first Russian parliament, a fake parliament as it was, but useful for propaganda, useful for agitation. And also his ability to bend as well with his flexibility. Some people have tried to paint Lenin as this inflexible, tyrant. And what I'd bring people's point and minds to is in January 17, he actually said, didn't he, we revolutionaries of the older generation may not live to see the decisive battles of this coming revolution. How wrong he was. Strikes in February 1917. He hadn't been in Russia for many years. He rushes to Russia, you know what I mean? And as a traditional Marxist or an orthodox Marxist, believed that there had to be a bourgeois revolution before, a socialist revolution, and actually bends to Trotsky's view that actually they could start it, but obviously the revolution would need supporting because, it was a peasant society, not got the productive capacity, for the needs of people. But actually did bend to Trotsky's idea and actually argued that with others in the Bolshevik Party. So when people say, is he relevant? For me, he's massively relevant, his writings, but also his tactical flexibility, which applies to every single one of us in Labour. I'm just about still in it, do you know what I mean? But also for outside of Labour, because obviously what Lenin tried to argue all the time is that agitation within parliamentary systems are important, but essentially it's the struggle outside of Parliament with workers, supporting each other and taking action that will be that fundamental shift. So is he relevant? Definitely.
Tactical flexibility, quite right. I don't think anybody's mentioned that yet. Good points. Bringing in Pat Byrne next. I'm muting you now. Hello, Pat.
Thanks, Tina. This is Pat Byrne from Labour International. Our constituency party for party members outside the UK, and I'm based over in Brazil. What I wanted to talk about was one of the inconsistencies of Lenin, and which I think had profound consequences. And I'm taking on board what Lars talked about, which is often forgotten, that Lenin made the Russian Revolution not as a communist, but as a social democrat. revolutionary social democrat, but a social democrat nevertheless. And in that, he was basically carrying on the Marxist tradition of Marx and Engels, who'd helped and pushed for the formation of mass united working class parties. And all the famous names we know, like Luxemburg and James Connolly and so on, were all active in the social democratic movement and formed the left wing of it. And in that way, they were able to reach the mass of workers. Now, the strange thing was that when Lenin reached Russia in April 1917, there was the famous conference, Bolshevik conference, that they call, a lot of people refer to as the April Theses Conference, where he was able to, he won full support for overthrowing the provisional government and replacing it with a democratic dictatorship of the workers and the peasants. But something that is not so well known is that Lenin was defeated in that conference. He put forward that he put forward to that conference, which was, remember, it was the Russian Social Democratic and Labour Party brackets majority, which is what the Bolsheviks were. He put forward that the party immediately at that point should change its name to the Communist Party. And when they came to the vote, only one person voted for it, Lenin. All his comrades on the Bolshevik side thought he was crazy. And they argued against it, saying that, if you do this, the workers will be confused. If you change horses midstream, you'll just help the reformist wing, the Mensheviks, and so on. And I think that they were completely correct in rejecting that, because if they had formed the Communist Party in April, there would have been confusion, and I suspect that they might not even have been able to win the revolution, because party names and party organizations are important. And to split the workers' movement, which that would have been disastrous. Now, the sad thing was that, so Lenin accepted the conference decision. So they made the revolution as the left wing of social democracy. And then what happened? Not so long afterwards, because Lenin's prestige was so high, he was able to put forward that they should change their name to the Communist Party in 1918. And that was accepted. And on the basis of that, they then launched the drive for the Communist International, which was forming communist parties all over the world. And I think that was a major mistake. For example, in 1918, the Socialist International was formed, which was basically the second international revive. And they were forced under pressure to invite the Bolsheviks. And if you do a calculation, you'll find that the majority of that conference supported the Bolshevik line on the war. But they boycotted, the Bolsheviks boycotted that conference, which I think was a big mistake. And they thought, they had this idea that just by planting their flag in the ground, that the mass of the workers would come over to them because they were disillusioned with the Social Democrats. But actually, I think they misjudged the situation. I don't have time to go into that. But in fact, after the war, there was an explosion of support for the Social Democrats in terms of membership of the party, Social Democratic trade unions, and so on, because the workers didn't actually blame the Social Democrats for the war, because actually the Social Democrats had opposed the war beforehand, and hadn't played that they were not the leading forces in that war. So therefore, I think that then led to a fact that where the working class became divided, and one of the consequences was the success of Mussolini. It forced the communist movement to realize that they didn't get the majority of the workers behind them. So then they tried to come up with this idea of the United Front, but it didn't work. And this has caused a split within the movement ever since. And the reality is that I don't think trying to form separate, pure revolutionary parties works. I think all socialists have to work as much as they can within the mass arena of working class politics. In this case, in the unions, in the Labour Party in Britain. And I don't think we should be thinking in terms of trying to create a pure group that we can then break away. I think that's a terrible mistake. And I think what we have every reason, if you look at what's happened in the past period, we shouldn't take negative conclusions from that. We have every reason to believe that we can go further than what we did with Jeremy Corbyn's movement, and we can actually win a majority. It's the right wing who, in my opinion, don't deserve to be in the leadership of the organization, and we shouldn't give that over to them. So I think that Lenin still has a lot of relevance. On the positive side, what the role he played before the Russian Revolution, and on the negative side, what he did after the Russian Revolution, I think, was a mistake.
Thank you, Pat. I'm going to bring in Matthew Jones next. I'm going to unmute you now. Fire away.
You can hear me, okay. Right, yeah, I think this is really very useful. I think there's various things I think that should be drawn out. I mean, one is the nature of the party. There are certain events which are critical to the formation of particular parties. In the case of, and the comrades draw out the SPD. I mean, the key thing in terms of the SPD, of course, is the passing of the anti-socialist law by Bismarck, which then compels all socialists who are effectively exiled from all forms of socialist social organization to set up their own. So the party has to set up, cycling clubs and pubs and workers clubs, and all of its own entertainment has to be done through the structures of the party. Now that worked extremely well, contrary to what Bismarck thought was going to happen. So hence the structure of the SPD itself in those terms. And the key event in terms of the formation of the Bolshevik Party is clearly 1905. And you look at the writings of Trotsky or Lenin, and that is critical. You turn to the dress rehearsal for 1917. And what it does, of course, is it brings together the two forces which actually form the core of the Bolshevik Party. One of which, of course, is the skilled, organized working class, particularly in the main cities, in the main factories, and then the layer of intellectuals and in many cases even the sons of minor aristocrats, who are in revolt against the system, and a very popular revolt among the youth against the system. I mean, even down to the explosion of creativity in the early part of the century in Russia. You had these huge sort of artists, upsurge in art, and you have like sort of Mayakovsky, who's arrested for activity before the First World War, and he's first summoned to his sister and say, "Bring me some artist material so I can work in prison, and bring me Capital Volume 1 so I can read the necessary." So the thing is that the whole thing comes together in that sense, in that event. The other thing, of course, is the importance of both the understanding of the decline of capitalism, and if you look at both Lenin and Trotsky, and I think you have to look in many ways, you have to look at the two together, because they do form sort of the theoretical core of the revolution. Is that both of them understand that with Lenin in his imperialism and Trotsky throughout most of his writings, that capitalism has gone beyond maturity and is in the stage of decline. Most famously of course in the transitional program, Trotsky writes much later. In terms of the lessons out of 05, of course, the largest one is taken by Trotsky himself in terms of his results and prospects, in which he calls for a permanent revolution. So, well, obviously the lesson of 05 is that the capitalist class will not even fulfill its own historic mission to remove feudal aristocracy, because it's afraid of the working class, and therefore the working class itself must carry that out. Something that Lenin then only took up in the April theses. Having said, I mean, I know that people said afterwards, including Trotsky, that of course Lenin remarked that he hadn't actually read Permanent Revolution until well after the revolution had taken place, but he drew the same conclusion just from the point of the impact of the war and the upsurge, and moved away from his own existing position, and it's also the fact, that you come into this situation, where the Bolsheviks take power based on initially, of course, a party which is probably fewer than 20,000 members in the whole of Russia, and then suddenly explodes through 1917. From that to a 250,000 members. And then suddenly they acquire this state, they have to run the bloody thing, and they run a civil war, having been given the situation where, industrial production is reduced to less than 20% of what it was before the war. They have no army, apart from one division of Latvian riflemen. They have Trotsky, who managed to build a Red Army literally under fire. It's an extraordinary story, absolutely incredible. And the fact that they had, there were problems and issues, it's just one of those things. And I think that, you could go into a further debate about the nature of the revolutions in in the rest of Europe, and the effort to create a revolution in the rest of Europe, particularly Germany, but also in Italy. And I think, you know, the issues in terms of, do you split the social democracy or not, and all this sort of stuff. I mean, there's a whole debate about the nature of what happened in Germany, which you could go through. You could spend at least this period of time just discussing that. And I'm sure that Tina will be very, very happy to help with that. But you know, I think that, you know, again, for me, I mean, and I think that people should take this, and is that the Russian Revolution remains the greatest event in history because it does point the way to liberation of humanity. I mean, Serge makes this point very clearly. He says that, you know, the Russian Revolution points to the heart of the future, which is still the case because nobody's gone beyond that yet. You know, that's just the nature of where they're at. And I mean, the notion that it's a coup is just ludicrous and you know, an absurdity, particularly in the current situation. Thanks.
Thanks, Matthew. Yes, as it happened, I'm trying to convince somebody to do an opening on the German Revolution, which was fantastic and could have changed the history of the 20th century quite easily had it been successful. Okay, I'm going to take a last speaker from the floor is Mike Kennard, and I'm going to bring the main speakers back in for 5 minutes each to sum up. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi everybody, and happy May Day. There's a few points I want to take up, but I want to deal with this question of the coup. Revolutions don't take place in a day or 10 days. They take place over a period of time. The British bourgeois revolution started in the 1640s and wasn't culminated until 1688. What happened in Russia in 1917 was a short period, 10 days that shook the world. I recommend that book by John Reed, where the transfer of power was done by force. It was done by force because force was ranged against it. And that is the point of, that's a coup. That's what a coup is. But it's a democratic coup in this particular case because it had the support of a majority of the workers and peasants and soldiers. So yeah, I mean, a coup is a part of a revolution. I wanted actually to take out. I liked Derek's point about tactical flexibility, and that brings me on to what a point I want to take up with Alec. We don't see too many peasants in Britain at the moment, but what we do see is a growing number of dispossessed petty bourgeois small business people who, especially with the COVID crisis, are going to be forced out of business. They're going to be bankrupted by the banks because they are not going to get any loans are going to be on prohibitive rates. They are going to be out of business, and there is a layer there that we have to take account of, because if we don't take account of it as socialists, there are people on the far right who will have attractive messages for them. I mean, I believe that the dispossessed petty bourgeois were in fact quite a significant force in the counter-revolution in Germany. So yeah, I mean, yeah, Lenin adapted. This is the what we have to understand. Lenin took account of the prevailing conditions and the prevailing circumstances and adapted. The April theses were, in essence, his conversion to Trotskyism in some way. So yes, you need to have a simple message, peace, bread and land, or our own equivalent at the moment, but it has to be relevant, and that is the point. The other point is we mustn't be too shy about taking power. Sometimes we have to back our democracy with an iron fist.
Thank you, Mike. I'm going to bring in Robert first to sum up for about 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair. I've got a great deal to say because I think some of the contributions which I've heard have been very helpful, and I don't think that Vladimir Ilyich is taken such a beating as perhaps I thought he was going to do this evening. I'm delighted with that. Tam made some interesting points, which I don't disagree with, about certainly about party democracy, and it's a key to developing policies, and it's a key to developing ideas, and it's a key to moving forward. I mean, I think everyone in the Labour Left Alliance, including myself, who's a member of Labour Left Alliance, believes that, and that is a problem that we're constantly facing in the Labour Party at the moment. And for over the last 2 weeks, that is become so painfully obvious. Alex, there's an interesting one about unity. I mean, I've studied the time of 1919, 1920, particularly in Britain, and then it's true that Lenin was of the view when he told the British delegates to go back and form the Communist Party of Great Britain, which they did 100 years ago and in July, which I gave 26 years of my life to. That one of the things they ought to say is to, in fact, to form the party and then affiliate to the Labour Party. Okay, the Labour Party turned them down, and I seem to remember my grandfather telling me the last time that the CPGB applied to join the Labour Party was as late as 1945, continuing the need to understanding about how it's important to achieve that unity. And then at the moment, inside or outside the Labour Party, I decided now to go within the Labour Party. We ought to be talking more openly with other organisations about developing policies and about developing actions, because I fear that in the next few months to a year, we don't really understand the effect on the economy and the working people of this country the COVID virus pandemic is going to have. And I mentioned in my earlier introduction, 6 million people may be out of work. We are talking civil unrest, with at least, and the left needs to have a response to it. Derek made some interesting points about Lenin's flexibility, and I think I agree largely with that. Pat from Brazil, my heart goes out to you, all to comrades in Brazil, about that idiot that they've got over there and the problems that it's facing. I think the decision to form the Communist International, the Comintern as it was known, was the right one. I think it was the thing that tried to establish communist parties in every country of the world, with a link to Moscow, of course. And I don't think it was done originally, maybe what came later, but it was originally devised to support and understand and give him practical support to communist parties throughout the world in trying to develop the revolution. It became something a bit different later, but I'm not going to criticize even the Comintern for what it tried to achieve in the 1930s at its 7th Congress. We're trying to develop the Popular Front, which of course developed reasonably well in England, where you had Harry Pollitt on the same platform as Nye Bevan and Stafford Cripps. I'm not looking at a lot to say more. Again, Mike said some interesting things about Lenin's way he could adapt policy, adapt ideas, and that's a lesson for us. I'm going to finish by something that he said, but I've been following the little boxes at the bottom. Interesting what David Gannon has been saying throughout this, that the Lenin and his Bolsheviks called for peace, land, and bread, and that was a policy they stuck with. David has suggested that is that something we should be looking for as one of our slogans? Occurs to me, possibly. I think in the next few months, something like jobs, homes, and health is going to be the slogan that we're going to be constantly reminded of as we fight the recession I believe we're going to have, and the social consequences that it will produce. I'd like to thank Labour Left Alliance for organising, in my final words, organising this evening. It's been, I shall come to other webinars of the organisation of which I'm a member and enjoy it, and except to say, and finally to say that I'm glad that we've aired the life of Lenin, the politics of Lenin, the imagination of Lenin, the inspiration to me of Lenin. And as I say, my last words to introduce him to him, he sits on my desk proudly, has done for the last 50 years. And as I say, I'm delighted to talk about him this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you very much. And I'm sure we all enjoyed your contribution. I'm bringing in now Lars for 5 minutes to sum up.
Okay, well, lots of issues, and I got to go every which way, so it's a little hard to come up with a summary statement. But let me the comments by Alec, if my notes are correct, about slogans. As it happens, slogans were something very important to these guys back then. Finding them, choosing them, getting them so that you could put them on a banner, you know, is in fact the whole image and the reality of banners was a big deal. So you're right to look at the slogans. And this, I think, is a good story you might like, is the other great slogan of 1917 is all power of the Soviets. And that slogan, this is a little bit of historical research that I've done myself, but where did it when was it first used? And it turns out rather late in the day. That is to say, the first time I've seen it, it was used as in a Bolshevik paper was it was in May. It was sort of 2 months at least. Is that right? 3 months after the February Revolution, and a long time after the April thesis, et cetera, et cetera. So where did that slogan come from? And if I've got it tracked down correctly, it came first from some local middle guy in Petrograd who needed to write out the slogan on a banner for the April demonstrations on April 21st. And he needed to get it on a banner so he could all power to the Soviets. And before that, they had much more clumsy, longer phrases. And Lenin was going out and either read in the papers or saw himself about this slogan that was used on the banner, and he adopted it. So I like, that's a good story, I think, because it shows that he's in the midst of things and getting it out. And I think that why I think the all power of the Soviets is the key slogan of 1917, and I've written a whole series with that title, All Power of the Soviets, online, because it relates to, okay, peace, land, and bread it focuses on what everybody wanted, but the Bolsheviks really stood out for the solution of how to get those things. And how to get those was to all power of the Soviets, which essentially meant kick out the bourgeoisie, kick out the elite, have an entirely socialist, have an entirely Soviet, all power. That's the key word, all power to the Soviets. And that's just an issue that was right down, and the idea of having a broad coalition of socialists was fine, except that sometimes you have issues where you have to be one or the other. And some of the socialists in 1917 said, oh, well, we need to make a deal with the agreement of some kind with the capitalists. And the other side said, no, that was the Bolshevik plus other people in other parties. But the only party that stood for it was the Bolsheviks. So all power of the Soviets is the key slogan of 1917. And also the thing about tactical flexibility. Well, of course, it's very true, but what I think has been underestimated over these years, and it's my own research focus, is the other side of that, a certain unity of Lenin's outlook throughout its entire life. And if I had to put it where it was, I could quote his Nadezhda Krupskaya, his widow. She said at his funeral, the key thing that animated Lenin all his life was the idea of the working class as the leader of all the oppressed, and the fact that they do it, which what I was calling here hegemony. So in practical terms, that's the peasants' question. So I have a tendency, I'm not just going to mention it, it's not going to get into it, but that there was more continuity in 1917 with the past and less, what was the word that was used here, conversion to Trotskyism. But we can fight that out later. What I want to say is that there was a unity to Lenin's own particular passion throughout his life, and it is this idea, I think, and Krupskaya thought, that of the working class as the leader of everybody else that needed leading. So it was a two layer view of the revolution. So I also will end now with thanking Tina, thanking everybody here. I really intense. I have to go down and lie down now because I have been paying so much attention to everybody and thinking so hard. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Lars. These Zoom meetings are actually more strenuous than real life meetings.
Yeah, that's right.
As you know, every Thursday we're looking at the history of the labor movement in these webinars. We had a very good discussion on Clause 4, but we will continue to have these historical educational programs, as well as try to put on some debates around some issues. So I'm hoping comrades will sign up to the Labour Left Alliance and join us in some more of these webinars. So thank you all very much, and see you soon, I hope.